Hello, everybody, and welcome to our first look at some Secrets of Strixhaven cards. Today, I've picked some of my favorite cards revealed so far, and I'm going to be talking about them in the context of draft. This set looks sweet, so let's get started. First up, we have Abigail, Poet Laureate. It's 1 white-black for a 2/3 flyer. It's legendary. It's a bird bard. Not that that's particularly relevant, because creature types aren't a big thing in this set. It has, whenever you cast a creature spell, Abigail becomes prepared. And while it's prepared, you may cast a copy of its spell. Doing so unprepares it. So these prepared cards are a new type of mechanic found in this set. Heroic Stanza is the spell. You can cast this once you've got Abigail prepared, and you can put a +1/+1 counter on target creature for 1 and white-black hybrid at sorcery speed. Now, Abigail is a great card on its own. 3 mana, 2/3 flyer is a pretty good rate. You're going to be casting plenty of creature spells to get it prepared, and then once you've prepared it, you can cast Stanza, grow one of your creatures. Oftentimes, you're going to want to target one of your other creatures that isn't Abigail, because that way, if they kill the Abigail, you still are going to have been left with a like value that stays on the battlefield. Though, of course, growing Abigail can also be pretty nice because it does have flying, so you can kind of strategize around that. White-black also has a kind of keyword mechanic called repartee, which rewards you for targeting your own creatures with spells. So Abigail really does pay you, is a really nice enabler for that strategy, because your other creatures can have some benefits when you target them with stuff. So Abigail, Poet Laureate, the perfect card for black-white. There are less supported color combinations in this set. There's just the 5 schools. And so taking multicolored cards early can also be better in this sort of draft format when compared to other draft formats. So Abigail is a great way to kick things off. Next up is Fractal Mascot, another multicolored card that I wanted to talk about because it's one of the best versions of this effect that we've ever seen, and the fact that it's that common, it's multicolored, can kind of help that slip under the radar a little bit. But a 6 mana 6/6 kind of top-end creature that stabilizes you is a really good effect from previous formats, and this is a really good version of that because not only does it have trample, which means that it's really hard for your opponent to kind of race this if you are trying to get into a battle with, maybe they have a couple flyers, you're trying to attack them. Chump blocking this isn't an option. They're going to have to trade with it or do something like that. And tapping a creature and stunning it for a turn does mean that it also kind of serves that life gain purpose as well. If you're getting attacked by a bunch of creatures, tapping one of them and stunning them can be like the equivalent of gaining 3 or 4 life in many situations. So Fractal Mascot, a really nice top-end card, and the blue-green deck has a mechanic that cares about casting spells that are more expensive than the spells you already have in play, or whatever it's called. It's called like Increment or something like that. And Fractal Mascot being a 6-drop means that those sorts of decks can get a little bit of extra value just from having an expensive card, and the fact that it's a good version of that is also quite nice. Next up, our first monocolored card, Graduation Day, is a card that I think is very interesting. It's 1 mana, it has the repartee mechanic, the keyword. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell that targets a creature, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So by itself, this card wouldn't be playable. And then you just start having to think, how many +1/+1 counters do I have to get out of this card to make up for the fact that if I top deck this in the late game, it's not going to necessarily do much. And I think if you can play this card in a dedicated deck and you can have the threat of playing this on turn 1 and then getting 3 or 4 counters from this over the course of the game, distributed where you want, I think that could be a pretty good card. And also you can set up some engines with this. Like if we combine this with the Abigail that we had before, all of a sudden that Abigail targeting spell is going to put 2 +1/+1 counters on things. And so all of a sudden Graduation Day is a really nice enabler, and I love seeing cards like this because that tends to make draft formats very interesting, where if you see Graduation Day and you have a deck that's dedicated to triggering repartee, then all of a sudden this is a really good payoff for you that you play it on turn 1. It can kind of snowball an entire game. Whereas if you're playing a different deck, maybe you're playing a red-white deck, which in this format cares about casting cards from your graveyard or cards leaving your graveyard, then all of a sudden you don't really care about Graduation Day, so you'll pass that along, and the deck that's interested in it can get it later. So I really like these sorts of cards. I think it's a cool design. It's one of those kind of hit or miss ones where you'll top deck this in the late game sometimes, and it's not going to do much, but when you play it early in a deck dedicated to it, I think it can do some really serious work and is a really cool uncommon as a result. Next up is Procrastinate. It's a really interesting take on a blue removal spell. It's X blue for a sorcery. Tap target creature, put twice X stun counters on it. If a permanent with a stun counter would become untapped, remove 1 from it instead. So one of the cool things about this card is there's a lot of blue removal spells in the past that have just been like an enchantment that taps a creature and keeps it tapped forever. But Procrastinate, if you use X for a high enough number, then the game's going to end almost every single time. Like if you use X equals 4 or X equals 5, most limited games aren't going to go 10 more turns. So Procrastinate functionally becomes a removal spell in those situations, but also could be kind of a tempo spell. And I'm not saying that it's an insane card or anything, but I think it's a really interesting design space that hasn't really been explored as much. There have been some cards that tap a creature for a couple of turns and put stun counters on it. So those cards then come unlocked and the card ends up being kind of bad because you don't end the game in time. Your opponent gets their card back. You've put yourself down a card for nothing. But procrastinate, because you can eventually just spend like 4 or 5 mana, tap your opponent's creature for like 8 turns or 10 turns. The game is going to end before that most of the time. And there's also a pretty cool mechanic in this set called Opus, which is the blue-red mechanic. And it rewards you for casting instants and sorceries, but also for casting instants and sorceries with converted mana cost 5 or more. And so if you use Procrastinate with X equals 4, you can like spend 5 mana casting instants or sorceries, and that can kind of like be a way to trigger those things with a little bit of flexibility for if you need to cast this on an earlier turn. Though generally speaking, I think if you are putting this in your deck, you want to cast it for like X equals 3 or 4 at least, because you really want to make sure that you kind of end the game before that creature comes untapped again. But still, a really cool design space and something that I'm really interested to see how it plays out, because I think it's a really kind of wild, like wacky take on blue removal that I haven't really seen before, and that definitely piques my interest. Next up is Arcane Omens. It's 4 and a black. It's a sorcery. It's got Converge, which is a returning mechanic that rewards you for the number of colors of mana spent to cast a spell. Target player discards X cards, where X is the number of colors of mana spent to cast this spell. This is a really interesting card to me because I think it's pretty weak and limited, even though it kind of reads out really powerfully. Because the way you immediately see this card, you're like, oh, I can spend 5 mana to make my opponent discard 5 cards. Oftentimes, however, the way that games of limited play out is by the time you get to like 5 mana, your opponent only has 1 or 2 cards in their hand anyway, and then this just becomes like an incredibly expensive like Mind Rot variant, which is like the classic 3 mana sorcery that makes your opponent discard 2 cards. And so Arcane Omens ends up being this sort of card that in my head would be like, oh, if I was playing a 5-color deck already, which I'm not even sure how well supported that would be, but it seems like there are enough Converge cards that they at least want it to be somewhat of an archetype. This seems like a sideboard card for those matchups where both players are heavy on card draw, and it just like absolutely devastates an opponent that's like got a fully stocked hand in the mid game. Because if you make your opponent discard 3 or 4 cards in the mid game, that's going to be pretty good if they have 3 or 4 cards left. It's just the problem is if you're playing against an aggressive deck, you're just not going to be coming up against opponents that have a lot of cards in hand, and spending 5 mana to make them discard 2 cards is just not going to be a winning strategy, because that's like a key mana breakpoint. You can do a lot of powerful things for 5 mana. Making your opponent discard a couple cards isn't it, but I still think it's a really interesting design, because I can imagine games where you're playing like this multicolored control deck against another multicolored control deck, and Arcane Omens is like the perfect sideboard card. And so I like these kind of interesting designs where you aren't really going to want to play this card in a lot of decks, I don't think, but it still has this really strong potential. And so it's kind of like one of those weird cards where it can sometimes have like really shine, but a lot of the time isn't the best. And I think having some of those cards is interesting. And also the fact that there might be a 5-color deck supported in the format is also really interesting, even though this isn't maybe the best payoff for it, because as I mentioned, they're not always going to have the cards to discard. Next up is Dual Tactics. So it's a single red mana for a sorcery. Dual Tactics deals 1 damage to target creature. It can't block this turn, and then it has flashback for blue-red. And so as I already mentioned, not blue-red, for 1 and a red. There's in the blue-red deck, there is a reward for casting instants and sorceries, even if they don't cost 5 mana. You can just get these kind of random little benefits from casting instants and sorceries. So this lets you trigger those twice. There's also some benefits if you are playing a like red-white deck. There are cards that care about you having things leave the graveyard. The flashback mechanic really works well there, and so this kind of fits nicely there. And so I think overall, the fact that this just has some nice flexibility, you can ping things down, you can just like use it on the same thing to deal 2 damage to a creature for 3 mana, which maybe isn't the best, but you are casting 2 spells, you get to use it from your graveyard. If you like mill it over or discard it to something, you get some extra value. I just think Dual Tactics is a really kind of cool design, and it does make 1 toughness creatures a little bit worse. Like if you're playing against an opponent and they have Dual Tactics in their deck, then like 1 toughness creatures, if you have a bunch of them, like a bunch of 3/1s or things like that, then Dual Tactics does kind of incentivize you to like sideboard cards a certain way if those cards aren't particularly great, because having your opponent like ping a couple of those, just get a nice 2-for-1 for just 3 mana, it can be pretty scary. I think it's just like a cool design that'll kind of grease the wheels and just be like the sort of card that you're happy to play in a couple of different decks. And the fact that it also stops something from blocking means that it can be a really scary thing if you're trying to be like stabilizing against somebody, because this single card can stop 2 blockers in a turn, even if it's not killing those creatures. If you kill your opponent, it doesn't really matter. So it's just kind of another cool card that maybe has some nice little synergies going on. And then the next card is Oracle's Restoration, another 1 mana play that I think is really, really interesting. So 1 mana sorcery. Target creature you control gets +1/+1 until end of turn. You draw a card and gain 1 life. So the green-black deck in this format has a mechanic called Infusion, or a keyword that rewards you when you gain life, just like any increment of life. So a lot of cards will be like, if you gain life this turn, you get this, or something like that. And so this is a nice, cheap way to trigger that. It's also a way to target your own creatures. So we said the black-white deck cares about targeting your own creatures, but that does mean that if you are playing like a black-green deck, you might have some of the black cards that care about targeting your own creatures. Oracle's Restoration can work well with those. The fact that it replaces itself Doesn't mean that this is the sort of card that you can play way more frequently. Like if this just was +1/+1 and gain 1 life, it would be unplayable. But the fact that it replaces itself means that you can kind of use this to grease your synergy wheels while also like moving forward, like in the game, like digging through your deck for your strong cards. It is a card that you need to be cautious using, because if you try to play this card and your opponent kills your creature in response, you get 2 for 1, then it's really bad. And that does limit its application somewhat, because it's not that powerful of an effect. Gaining 1 life, giving a creature +1/+1, especially if you're playing like a grindy black-green deck that maybe doesn't care about attacking that much, the +1/+1 at sorcery speed isn't necessarily going to be the biggest factor, because you might not be wanting to attack anyway. You might want to be playing on blocks. And so this seems like the sort of card that if you have enough of the payoffs for it, it could be really good. Once again, these are the sorts of cards I like. Or if you have the payoffs, they can do their thing. And if you don't have the payoffs, then it's a card that kind of zooms around the table and you can pick it up late for your deck, which is kind of a really sweet type of card to have in draft formats. And seeing these sorts of cards, we've seen multiple of them already, gives me a lot of confidence that this format's going to have some sweet things going on. Our final card that we're looking at is Diary of Dreams. It's 2 mana. It's the first of the book artifacts. So they're going to make book a type of artifact, which is kind of interesting. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, put a page counter on this artifact. And then you have 5, tap it, draw a card. This ability costs 1 less to activate for each page counter on this artifact. I think this card is a really sweet design. We've already seen a couple of cards that work well with this. We just saw that one, the sorcery, that's a 1 mana cantrip that works well with this. We saw the red card that can deal 1 damage to things and flashback, so you can get 2 counters onto this Diary of Dreams. And this is just a really kind of sweet win condition, because if you play this in the early turns, it does put you behind. You're putting a 2 mana play like card into play that you can't really use until the very late game, because you really need to be deploying cards from your hand, especially because you already spent 2 mana not really affecting the board state. But it's kind of like a ticking clock, because you play this card, all of a sudden it starts getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And once it costs just a couple of mana to activate the Diary of Dreams, then all of a sudden you're drawing 2 cards a turn, quickly overwhelm your opponent. Also, if you top deck this in the late game, you might just have the extra mana to start using this. If you have 8 mana in play and you play Diary of Dreams, you can immediately activate it, which makes this a pretty scary card to top deck. And so it just kind of gives some inevitability at uncommon, gives you a kind of game plan, and works really well with some of the other cards we've seen already. And so it's just a card that I'm pretty excited to try out and see if we can make it work, because it can be a little bit of a liability if the format's really fast to just put a 2 mana play that doesn't really affect the board state. But the fact that you can kind of build around it, have these cheap instants and sorceries, maybe some cards with flashback, some cheap cantrips, really does make Diary of Dreams kind of a cool card to potentially build around for a deck that kind of wants to go long and grind into the late game. That's going to do it for this video, though. Some sweet cards already. We'll be covering more awesome cards in the future, and I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll talk to you next time.